Alexander Cruz was no ordinary man. At the age of 42, he had already cemented himself as one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, commanding respect from business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities alike. His name was synonymous with innovation, success, and power. As the CEO of Cruz Tech, a tech empire that spanned continents, he was used to controlling every aspect of his life with precision, leaving no room for surprises. This morning was like any other, or at least it started that way. Alexander sat in the back seat of his sleek black sedan, silently watching the city pass by through the tinted windows. His driver navigated the familiar route to the headquarters of Cruz Tech, where meetings, deals, and decisions that would affect thousands awaited him. The sound of his phone buzzing briefly pulled his attention to the unread emails and calendar reminders that filled his screen. Everything was in order, yet there was something about today that gnawed at him. He couldn't quite place it, but an unusual restlessness had been hanging in the air since he woke up. The typically immaculate sky seemed just a touch grayer, and the usual hum of the city felt louder, more chaotic. As his car slowed near a school zone, Alexander glanced out of the window, momentarily distracted by the sight of children spilling out into the street, backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. The contrast between their carefree world and his calculated, high-stakes existence struck him. For a moment, he envied them. The simplicity of youth, the innocence of not yet being burdened by the weight of ambition or responsibility. And that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a boy, no older than 12, came dashing across the street, seemingly out of thin air. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching loudly as the car came to a sudden halt. Time seemed to slow as Alexander's heart skipped a beat, his hand instinctively gripping the door handle. The boy barely missed being hit by a few inches. He froze in front of the car, wide-eyed and panting from the sprint, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "What the hell?" Alexander muttered, still recovering from the shock. His usual composed demeanor was replaced by a flash of irritation, mingled with concern. He wasn't used to things happening outside of his control, especially not like this. He quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, his imposing 6-foot frame casting a long shadow over the boy. The boy looked up, his face a mix of fear, defiance, and something else, something that struck Alexander in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Hey kid." Alexander's voice came out harsher than he intended. "What do you think you're doing? You almost got yourself killed." The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kicked at the ground, avoiding eye contact, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. He wore a rumpled hoodie that looked like it had seen better days, and his sneakers were scuffed and worn. His dark brown hair was messy, sticking out in all directions, and there was a streak of dirt across his cheek. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something sharp in his eyes, a kind of alertness that seemed out of place for someone his age. "I'm fine," the boy mumbled finally, his voice low but steady. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" Alexander repeated, incredulous. "You just ran out into the middle of the street. You could have been seriously hurt." His tone softened slightly as he noticed the boy's thin, fragile frame, which seemed too small for the weight of the world the boy carried in his expression. The boy shrugged, still not looking up. "I said I'm fine. I'm late for something." Alexander studied him for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. He wasn't used to dealing with kids, especially not ones like this. Something about the boy's demeanor bothered him. There was a certain defiance in the way he spoke, like he was used to fending for himself, used to people not caring enough to push further. "What are you late for?" Alexander asked, his curiosity piqued. "School?" "Yes, school," the boy muttered, though his voice didn't carry the conviction of someone actually headed there. Alexander glanced toward the school building nearby, where students were still filing in. "You should head in then. I could take you," he offered, surprising himself with the gesture. He had never offered a ride to anyone outside of his business circles, let alone a random kid. But there was something about the boy that tugged at him, something inexplicably familiar. The boy's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing. "I don't need a ride. I'm not going far." "Suit yourself," Alexander said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just be careful next time." Without another word, the boy turned and ran, his small figure disappearing down the street. Alexander watched him go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of the boy's face from his mind. The defiance, the vulnerability, the strange sense of familiarity. It was unsettling. As Alexander climbed back into his car, he realized his heart was still racing. He was rarely rattled, even in the face of high-stakes negotiations or corporate takeovers. But that boy, something about him had pierced through his usual armor. For the rest of the ride to the office, he couldn't focus. The conversation with the boy replayed in his mind over and over. It wasn't just the near accident that bothered him. It was the look in the boy's eyes, a mix of rebellion and sadness that seemed all too familiar. By the time he arrived at Cruise Tech, his thoughts were a jumbled mess, something he was unaccustomed to. Usually, his mind was a well-oiled machine, focusing on one goal at a time, never wavering from the task at hand. But today he felt distracted, off balance. "Sir, are you all right?" his assistant Amanda asked as he stepped into the sleek, glass-paneled lobby of Cruise Tech. She was a sharp woman in her mid-30s, with a no-nonsense attitude that Alexander appreciated. She had worked for him for nearly a decade and was one of the few people who knew how to read his moods. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He shook his head, as if trying to clear away the lingering unease. "You seem distracted," Amanda pressed, handing him a tablet with the day's schedule. "Important meetings today. The board is expecting an update on the new AI project." "I know," Alexander said, waving her off. It's nothing." Amanda raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. She knew better than to question Alexander when he wasn't ready to talk. Instead, she followed him into the elevator, listing off the details of his first meeting as the doors slid shut. But even as the day progressed, with back-to-back meetings, presentations, and negotiations, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in his world. The encounter with the boy had unearthed a memory he had long buried, a memory of someone he hadn't thought about in years. Mia. She had been a whirlwind in his life, a passionate, fiery woman who had turned his world upside down for a brief, intense period. They had met when he was still building his company, back when he had less money but far more time to give. Their relationship had been a blur of late nights, laughter, and spontaneous adventures. But it had ended as quickly as it began, with both of them walking away, leaving nothing behind but a few bittersweet memories. Or so he thought. The image of the boy's face flashed in his mind again, and this time, the resemblance was unmistakable. There was something in his eyes, the shape of his jaw, the curve of his smile. It was as if he was looking at a reflection of someone he had known long ago. Could it be? No, it wasn't possible. He hadn't seen Mia in over a decade. There was no way the boy could be. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Alexander had always prided himself on being a man of logic, of reason. He didn't believe in coincidences, and he certainly didn't believe in fate. But something about this encounter didn't feel random. It felt like a warning. Or maybe a second chance. The city skyline was draped in the hues of a fading afternoon, its towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets below. Alexander Cruz stood in front of the glass wall of his corner office, the world bustling beneath him, unaware of the turmoil that stirred within. His gaze was distant, fixed on the horizon, but seeing nothing. His mind a storm of fragmented memories and possibilities. The boy, Ethan. The name echoed in his mind like a distant whisper, pulling him back to a time he had long since buried. He had always been a man who focused on the future, on what lay ahead rather than what was left behind. But today, the past was clawing its way back into his life, unsettling everything he thought he knew. The meeting earlier in the day had been routine, yet the encounter with that boy had unsettled him in a way no business challenge ever had. The resemblance between Ethan and Mia was undeniable, her eyes, her defiance, and something else that tugged at his heart, something he couldn't yet define. Alexander turned away from the window, feeling an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He hadn't thought about Mia in years, not since their whirlwind romance had ended, but now memories of her were rushing back, vivid and uninvited. He could almost see her, standing in the corner of the room, her laughter echoing in his ears, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders as she looked at him with those eyes that always saw more than he wanted to reveal. They had met in Paris, of all places, when Alexander was still on the cusp of greatness. He wasn't yet the billionaire CEO of a tech empire, but his ambition had been burning bright. He had traveled to France to close a crucial deal that would lay the foundation for what cruise tech would eventually become. Mia had been there for entirely different reasons. An artist, full of passion, seeking inspiration in the City of Lights. They had been opposites in almost every way, but somehow they fit. For a brief period, they had burned bright together, sharing a love that was as passionate as it was fleeting. The end had been inevitable. Alexander had chosen his path, one of ambition and power, while Mia had chosen freedom. He had always wondered what might have happened if things had been different, but he had buried those thoughts deep, along with any lingering feelings. Or so he thought. His assistant, Amanda, knocked on the door, pulling him out of his reverie. "Sir, I have the documents for the next meeting," she said, her voice professional but with a hint of concern. Amanda had known Alexander long enough to sense when something was off, but she also knew better than to pry. "Do you need anything else?" Alexander shook his head, his focus slowly returning to the present. "No, thank you, Amanda. Just leave them on the desk." Amanda hesitated for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning his face, but she didn't push further. She quietly placed the papers on the desk and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. As soon as she was gone, Alexander sat down heavily in his chair. He reached for his phone, hesitating for just a moment before pulling up an old contact. He hadn't called this number in years, but it was still saved in his phone. Mia's sister, Camila. His finger hovered over the call button. What was he even going to say? "Hi, I think I may have just met my son today." The idea seemed absurd, yet the feeling in his gut refused to go away. He needed answers. Before he could second-guess himself, he hit the button and held the phone to his ear. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before it clicked, and a familiar voice came through. "Hello?" It was Camila, and she sounded exactly as he remembered, warm but with an underlying strength that reminded him of Mia. "Camila, it's Alexander," he said, his voice steady but unsure of how to proceed. "I know it's been a long time, but I need to ask you something." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could almost hear her thoughts racing, trying to piece together why he was calling after all these years. "Alexander," she finally said, her tone cautious. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. What's this about?" Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself. "It's about Mia and a boy." Another long silence. When Camila spoke again, her voice was guarded. "Ethan." The name hit him like a blow. Ethan. The boy who had run across the street earlier today, the boy who looked so much like Mia, the boy who could very well be his son. "Is he?" Alexander's voice faltered for the first time. "Is he mine?" Camila didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Alexander feared that she had hung up. But then, with a sigh, she answered, "Yes, Alexander. He's your son." The words echoed in his mind, confirming what he had suspected but hadn't been ready to face. Ethan was his son. The realization hit him with the weight of 12 lost years. Years he would never get back. Years of not knowing, of not being there. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was pain in the question, a sense of betrayal that he hadn't expected to feel. He had thought he and Mia had left things on good terms, or at least as good as they could be under the circumstances. But she had kept this from him, kept their son from him. She wanted to, Camila said softly. But by the time she found out, you were already building cruise tech. You had moved on, and Mia, she didn't want to burden you. She thought you were better off without knowing. Better off? Alexander repeated, incredulous. How could she think that? She thought she was protecting you both. You were on the verge of something huge, and she didn't want to stand in the way of that. And after Ethan was born, things got complicated. She didn't know how to tell you. And then, well, Camila's voice trailed off, the weight of unspoken things hanging heavily between them. Alexander leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He had always prided himself on being in control of his life. But this was something he had no control over, something that had been decided for him without his knowledge. "How is he?" Alexander asked quietly, not even sure what he was hoping to hear. "He's struggling," Camila admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "Mia passed away 2 months ago. It's been hard on him. He's been skipping school, acting out. I've been doing my best, but Ethan's always been a tough kid. And without Mia..." Alexander felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He hadn't known. He hadn't been there for Mia in her final moments. And now he hadn't been there for Ethan, his own son, who was struggling through life without the support of a father. The conversation with Camila weighed heavily on his mind as he ended the call. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan from his thoughts, and now, knowing that the boy was his son only intensified the emotions he had been trying to suppress. Meanwhile, Ethan was sitting on the roof of his apartment building, staring at the city below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. But Ethan barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on the strange man he had met earlier today. He didn't know why, but something about that man had unsettled him. There had been a strange familiarity in the way the man had looked at him, something in his voice that had made Ethan feel both angry and curious at the same time, that he kicked at the loose gravel under his feet, frustrated. He didn't need another adult trying to tell him what to do. His mom was gone, and since then, everyone had been treating him like he was some kind of charity case, his aunt, his teachers, even the kids at school. He hated it. Ethan had always been independent, even when his mom was alive. She had raised him to be strong, to not rely on anyone else for help. But now, everything felt different. He felt different. There was a hollowness in his chest that he didn't know how to fill. And no matter what he did, skipping school, getting into fights, running from his problems, nothing seemed to make it go away. A sharp gust of wind blew across the roof, rustling his hair and making him shiver. He pulled his hoodie tighter around him, wishing he could disappear into the fabric. Maybe if he could just vanish, all of the pain and confusion would disappear too. But deep down, Ethan knew that wasn't true. The emptiness wasn't going anywhere, no matter how much he tried to run from it. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His aunt, Camila, had a way of finding him, no matter how far he tried to run. "Ethan," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "I've been looking for you." Ethan didn't respond, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon. Camila was patient, though. She always was. "I talked to him today," she said after a long pause. "The man you met earlier. He's your father." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't say anything. "He didn't know about you, Ethan. He didn't know until today." Ethan finally turned to look at her, his face a mix of confusion and anger. "Why didn't Mom tell him?" Camila sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She thought she was doing the right thing. She didn't want to disrupt his life, and she didn't want you to grow up feeling like a burden. But now things are different. Ethan clenched his fists, his emotions warring inside him. Part of him wanted to scream, to cry, to punch something. But another part of him was curious about this man who was his father, this stranger who had unknowingly been a part of his life all along. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Camila didn't have an answer for him. But as they sat together in the fading light, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if his life was about to change once again. Alexander sat in his sleek black car, staring out at the narrow, worn streets of the neighborhood. The area was far from the world he knew, so different from the towering glass buildings and pristine landscapes he had come to associate with his life as CEO of Cruise Tech. The contrast between this neighborhood and his multi-million-dollar estate was stark, almost jarring. He had known that Mia had lived a modest life after they parted ways, but seeing it now, with his own eyes, was something else entirely. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his mind racing with a storm of thoughts. How had it come to this? A son he didn't know about, a boy he had never had the chance to raise or even meet until today, was now the center of his thoughts. The magnitude of what Mia had kept from him weighed heavily on his chest. He was still angry, still hurt, but at the same time, there was a sense of longing he hadn't anticipated, longing for the connection that had been stolen from him. His phone buzzed in the seat beside him. He He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Camila. "Ethan's home now. You can come up whenever you're ready." Alexander's heart rate quickened. He was about to meet his son, properly this time, and the weight of that moment pressed down on him like a physical force. He had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes negotiations, but nothing compared to this. How did one introduce themselves to their own child after 12 years of absence? He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The car felt stifling, too small for the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. Without a second thought, he pushed open the door and stepped out, the cool evening air hitting him like a refreshing wave. He glanced up at the modest apartment building, its brick exterior worn and cracked, but it had a certain warmth to it. This had been Ethan's home, a place filled with memories that Alexander would never be a part of. With determined steps, he crossed the street and approached the entrance. His mind replayed the few brief moments he had spent with Ethan earlier in the day. The way the boy had looked at him, so guarded and distant, and the startling resemblance to Mia. Ethan was a stranger to him, yet a part of him, and Alexander wasn't sure how to navigate that. The door buzzed open, and Alexander stepped into the dimly lit hallway. He could hear the faint sound of voices from somewhere above, Camila's, steady and calm, and Ethan's, quieter, but filled with the unmistakable edge of a child trying to hold back his emotions. Alexander's stomach twisted with anxiety as he climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the apartment door, it was already open. Camila stood just inside, her expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. She offered him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's in his room," she said quietly, stepping aside to let Alexander in. "I told him you were coming. He doesn't know how to feel about it, but he's willing to talk." Alexander nodded, grateful for her help. Camila had always been the more grounded one, the one who knew how to handle difficult situations with grace. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Camila gave him an encouraging nod before retreating to the small kitchen, giving him space. The apartment was modest but cozy, filled with little touches that spoke of a loving home. Framed photos on the walls, books stacked on shelves, and a few pieces of Ethan's artwork pinned to the fridge. Alexander's eyes lingered on one particular drawing, a crude but heartfelt depiction of a mother and son, holding hands under a bright sun. Mia's name was written in shaky letters above the figure, and Alexander felt a pang of guilt that he had never been there to be part of that picture. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the faint rustling of movement inside. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin, before gently knocking on the door. "Ethan," he called softly. There was a pause, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. The door creaked open a bit more, and there stood Ethan, his expression guarded, his dark eyes, Mia's eyes, watching Alexander with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice low and uncertain. Alexander offered a tentative smile. "Hey, Ethan, can I come in?" Ethan shrugged, stepping aside to let him in. The room was small but neat, with posters of video games and superheroes plastered on the walls. A pile of comic books lay on the floor near the bed, and a few action figures were scattered on a desk in the corner. It was the room of a boy who was still trying to hold on to childhood, even as the weight of the world pressed down on him. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air. He didn't know where to start. How do you begin to build a bridge that had been left unattended for over a decade? "I wanted to talk to you," Alexander said gently, trying to gauge Ethan's mood. "I know this is a lot to take in." Ethan sat down on the edge of his bed, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it's weird." Alexander couldn't help but chuckle softly at the honesty in Ethan's words. "It is weird," he admitted, sitting down in the chair by the desk. "It's really weird for me too." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. Alexander glanced around the room, taking in the small details of Ethan's life, the things that had shaped him, the things Alexander had missed. He wondered what kind of boy Ethan was, what he liked, what he dreamed about. He wanted to know everything, but he knew that would take time and patience. I want to be honest with you, Ethan, Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I didn't know about you. I didn't know you existed until today. Ethan's eyes flicked up to meet his, a spark of something, anger, confusion, flashing in them. So what? Mom just never told you. Alexander nodded slowly. Yes, she didn't tell me. But if I had known. He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. How could he explain that if he had known, everything would have been different? That he would have been there for Ethan, been a father to him, instead of a stranger? The words felt hollow in his throat. Ethan looked away, his jaw clenched. It doesn't matter now. She's gone. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Alexander's heart ached for him. He wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he didn't know how. He had never been good at emotions, at dealing with feelings beyond the cold, logical world of business. But this was different. This was his son. I know you're angry, Alexander said softly, and you have every right to be. I wish I could change the past, but I can't. All I can do now is be here, if you'll let me. Ethan's eyes flicked back to him, and for a moment, Alexander thought he saw something soften in the boy's expression. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same guarded look he had worn since the moment they met. Why now? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Why do you care now? You've been living your life for, forever without me. The question stung, but Alexander couldn't blame him for asking it. From Ethan's perspective, he was just another adult who had let him down, another person who hadn't been there when it mattered. But that wasn't the truth. Not entirely. I care because you're my son, Alexander said, his voice firm but gentle. I didn't know about you before, but now that I do, I want to be part of your life. I know I've missed a lot. Too much, but I want to make it right if you'll let me. Ethan didn't respond right away. He sat there, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, his face a mix of emotions that Alexander could only guess at. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan let out a small sigh. I don't know, he muttered. I don't know what to think. Alexander nodded, understanding the confusion in his words. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said gently. Take your time. I'll be here whenever you're ready. The room fell into silence once more, but it wasn't the same tense silence as before. There was something different now, something more open, more honest. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. I'll leave my number with your aunt, Alexander said as he stood up, his heart heavy but hopeful. If you ever want to talk, or if you need anything, I'm just a phone call away. Ethan didn't say anything, but Alexander saw the small nod he gave, and that was enough for now. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a start that Alexander was determined to nurture, no matter how long it took. As he left the apartment and stepped back out into the night, Alexander felt a strange mix of emotions: regret, hope, fear. But above all, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had missed the first 12 years of his son's life, but he wasn't going to miss any more, and no matter how long it took, he would earn Ethan's trust. He would prove that he wasn't just some absent father who had stumbled into his life by accident. He would be the father Ethan deserved. The next few days passed in a blur for both Alexander and Ethan. For Ethan, his world was turned upside down after learning that the man he had met, a complete stranger, was his father. He spent hours locked in his room, replaying that conversation in his head, trying to make sense of everything. How could his mother have kept this secret for so long? How could she have died without ever telling him the truth? Anger mixed with sadness and confusion, swirling inside Ethan's mind. He tried to focus on school, on hanging out with his friends, on doing all the things that felt normal. But everything was tinged with the knowledge that nothing would ever really be the same. His father, Alexander Cruz, wasn't just some man running a company. He was his father, a fact Ethan didn't know how to process yet. Meanwhile, Alexander was grappling with his own turmoil. Every night, after long hours at the office, he would come home to his sprawling estate, the silence of the massive house weighing down on him in a way it never had before. His world of sharp suits, important meetings, and business acquisitions felt distant. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Ethan. The boy's face, those intense eyes, so much like Mia's, haunted him. For years, Alexander had believed he had everything: power, wealth, success. He had spent his life building an empire, always moving forward, always focused on the next big deal. But now all of it felt hollow. He had missed out on something far more important: his own son's life. Camila had been kind and supportive, though Alexander could tell she was protective of Ethan. She had called a few times, checking in, updating him on how Ethan was doing. But it was clear that she was cautious about letting Alexander back into Ethan's life too quickly. Ethan was fragile, still grieving the loss of his mother, still trying to figure out who he was in this new reality. Alexander understood that. He didn't want to rush things either. He knew he had to be patient. But patience had never been his strong suit. One evening, after another long day at the office, Alexander found himself sitting at his dining room table, a glass of whiskey in hand. The sprawling view of the city lights outside his floor-to-ceiling windows usually gave him a sense of satisfaction, of accomplishment. But tonight, it only highlighted the emptiness he felt inside. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text message from Camila. "Ethan asked about you today." The message was simple, but it sent a wave of relief through Alexander. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, Ethan was starting to come to terms with everything. He quickly typed out a response. What did he say? There was a pause, and then the reply came. He wanted to know if you were coming back to see him. Alexander's heart leapt in his chest. He hadn't expected Ethan to ask that so soon. A part of him had feared that after their conversation, Ethan might shut him out completely. But now it seemed like there was a crack in the wall, a small opening that Alexander could work with. He stared at the message for a moment, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to overwhelm Ethan, but he also didn't want to miss the opportunity. "I can come tomorrow after school if he wants." He waited anxiously for Camila's response. After what felt like an eternity, his phone buzzed again. "He's okay with that. Come around 4. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tomorrow. He would see Ethan again tomorrow. The thought filled him with both excitement and trepidation. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that this was the next step in rebuilding the relationship that had never existed. The following day, Alexander found himself standing outside Camila's apartment building once again, a familiar knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. It was strange. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with ease, but the thought of seeing his son made him feel like a nervous wreck. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it swung open to reveal Camila, her face warm but cautious. "Hi, Alex," she greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. "Ethan's in his room." "I'll get him." Alexander nodded, stepping into the apartment. The place was as cozy as he remembered, filled with the same sense of warmth and family that his own mansion lacked. As he waited, he glanced around, his eyes landing once again on the drawing of Ethan and Mia that was pinned to the fridge. A pang of regret shot through him. He would never have a chance to meet Mia again, to ask her why she had kept Ethan a secret, or to make amends for the way things had ended between them. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Ethan standing in the hallway, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his jeans, his expression uncertain. "Hey," Alexander said, his voice softer than usual. "Hey," Ethan replied, his tone just as tentative. Camila hovered for a moment, clearly unsure whether she should stay or give them space. Alexander gave her a small nod, silently letting her know that he would handle it. She offered a reassuring smile before retreating into the kitchen, leaving the two of them alone. Alexander gestured toward the small living room. "Do you want to sit down?" Ethan shrugged, but he moved toward the couch and sat down, his movements stiff, as if he didn't quite know how to act around his father yet. Alexander sat down in the armchair opposite him, the tension between them palpable. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched on, awkward and heavy, until Ethan finally broke it. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, "about everything, about you." Alexander leaned forward slightly, trying to gauge where Ethan was going with this. "What have you been thinking?" Ethan fidgeted with the sleeve of his shirt, his eyes downcast. "I don't know. It's just weird. I didn't even know you existed until a few days ago. Now you're here, and it's like everything's different." "I know," Alexander said gently. "It's a lot to take in. I can't even imagine how confusing it must be for you." Ethan nodded, but he didn't say anything more. Alexander watched him carefully, trying to figure out what the boy was feeling. He could see the conflict in Ethan's eyes, the anger, the confusion, but also the curiosity. Ethan was still trying to process everything, just as Alexander was. "I want you to know something, Ethan," Alexander said after a moment. "I know I haven't been around for your whole life, but now that I know you, I want to be here. I want to get to know you, if you'll let me." Ethan's eyes flicked up to meet his for a brief second before darting away again. "It's just weird," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's heart ached for him. He could see how lost Ethan felt, how hard he was trying to make sense of it all. And Alexander didn't blame him. It was weird. It was confusing. But that didn't change the fact that they were connected, that they were family. "I understand," Alexander said softly. "And I don't expect things to change overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere." Ethan didn't respond right away. He sat there, his hands fidgeting in his lap, his face a mixture of uncertainty and frustration. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at Alexander, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that took Alexander by surprise. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with fear that Alexander's heart broke a little at the question. It was such a simple question, but it carried so much weight. Ethan didn't know what the future held, and honestly, neither did Alexander. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to walk away from his son. "We take it one step at a time," Alexander said, his voice steady. "There's no rush. We'll figure it out together." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Finally, he gave a small nod, and Alexander felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and that was all he needed. Over the next few weeks, Alexander and Ethan started to build a tentative relationship. It wasn't easy, far from it, but they were both trying. Alexander would stop by the apartment after work, sometimes bringing dinner or a small gift for Ethan. They would sit together in the living room, talking about school, video games, or anything else Ethan was interested in. At first, the conversations were stilted, awkward, as they both tried to navigate this new dynamic. But slowly, they started to find a rhythm. Ethan began to open up more, asking questions about Alexander's work, his life, and what it had been like before he knew about Ethan. Alexander, in turn, learned more about his son, his love of comics, his dreams of becoming an artist, and his favorite video games. There were still moments of tension, of course. Ethan was still grieving the loss of his mother, and sometimes that grief manifested as anger. Anger at Mia for keeping the secret, anger at Alexander for not being there, anger at the world for being so unfair. But Alexander was patient. He listened, he reassured, and he never pushed Ethan to feel or act a certain way. He let Ethan set the pace. As the weeks went by, they grew more comfortable around each other. The gap between them slowly began to close, inch by inch. They weren't quite father and son yet, not in the way either of them had imagined, but they were getting there. And that was enough for now. One day, after a particularly good conversation, Ethan looked up at Alexander and said, "Maybe we can hang out more, like outside of here. You know, like normal people." Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I'd like that." It was a small step, but it felt like a giant leap forward. Over the weeks that followed, Alexander found himself growing more attached to Ethan than he ever thought possible. Each interaction with his son was like peeling back layers of a complex, beautiful painting. At first, it had been awkward and tense, but now there was something different. The once cautious conversations had become more open, more natural. Ethan was beginning to trust him, little by little, and Alexander was determined to make sure he never did anything to break that trust. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when they planned their first official outing. Alexander had suggested they go to the city's museum. Ethan had mentioned his interest in art, and Alexander thought it would be a perfect way to bond. But to his surprise, Ethan hesitated. "You're not going to make me wear a suit, are you?" Ethan had asked, his face scrunched in uncertainty. "It's just, I don't want it to be like fancy or anything." Alexander couldn't help but chuckle at the question. He realized then how much Ethan still saw him as the CEO, the polished businessman, always dressed in the finest tailored suits, always focused on his work. It stung a little, but it was also understandable. Ethan had grown up without knowing him. How could he see anything beyond the image the world saw? No suits, I promise. Alexander reassured him with a grin. It's just you and me hanging out. Casual. Ethan gave a small nod, still cautious but clearly interested in the idea. It was another step toward normalcy, toward building something real between them. And that's all Alexander wanted. For Ethan to see him as more than a title, more than the billionaire CEO he read about online. The day of their outing arrived, and Alexander found himself filled with nervous excitement. He picked Ethan up from Camila's apartment around noon, making sure to wear jeans and a simple shirt to match the casual tone he had promised. When Ethan came down, dressed in his usual sneakers, jeans, and a hoodie, Alexander felt a sense of relief. They were just two people getting to know each other. As they drove toward the museum, the conversation flowed easily. Ethan talked about school, about a project he was working on for his art class, and Alexander listened intently, asking questions that showed his genuine interest. He marveled at how creative his son was, how passionate he seemed about drawing. It was something Alexander had never expected, but it was also a gift, an opportunity to bond with Ethan in a way that went beyond small talk. "Do you ever draw?" Ethan asked suddenly, turning to look at Alexander as they drove. Alexander paused, caught off guard by the question. Drawing? He hadn't picked up a pencil for anything other than signing contracts or taking notes in years. His life had been so focused on business, on building his company, that the idea of drawing for fun had never even crossed his mind. "I used to," he admitted, glancing over at Ethan, "when I was younger, but it's been a long time." Ethan seemed surprised by this. "You did? What did you draw?" Alexander chuckled, feeling a bit nostalgic. "Mostly sketches of buildings. I wanted to be an architect when I was your age." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Really? What happened?" Alexander sighed, his smile fading a little. "Life happened, I guess. I got caught up in other things, school, work, and then one day I just stopped. I haven't really thought about it since." Ethan was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this new information about his father. It was another layer peeled back, another glimpse into who Alexander was beyond the businessman. "You should try again," Ethan said, his voice soft but genuine. "I mean, if you liked it." Alexander glanced at him, feeling a warmth in his chest. Ethan's suggestion was so simple, but it carried so much weight. He wasn't just talking about drawing. He was offering Alexander a chance to reconnect with something he had lost, just as they were trying to reconnect with each other. "Maybe I will," Alexander replied, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe I will." The museum was bustling with activity when they arrived, families and tourists wandering through the grand entrance. Alexander had arranged for a private tour, wanting to give Ethan the best experience possible, but he hadn't mentioned it to him. He didn't want to overwhelm him with the perks of being the son of a billionaire. This was supposed to be about spending time together, not about status or wealth. As they walked through the museum, the private guide leading them through different exhibits, Alexander noticed how engaged Ethan was. The boy's eyes lit up as they moved from room to room, his focus sharp as he took in each painting, each sculpture. It was clear that Ethan wasn't just interested in art, he was passionate about it. "This one's cool," Ethan said as they stopped in front of a massive abstract painting. The bold, chaotic brushstrokes of color seemed to burst from the canvas, drawing both of them in. "It's like messy but perfect at the same time." Alexander nodded, studying the painting alongside his son. "That's a good way to describe it. Sometimes the things that seem messy are the most beautiful." Ethan looked up at him, surprised by the insight. Alexander could see the gears turning in Ethan's head, as if he were trying to make sense of the man standing next to him, the father he was only just beginning to know. "You like it?" Ethan asked. "I do," Alexander said. "It's different from what I'm used to, but I like how it makes me feel. Art is like that, isn't it? It's not just about what you see. It's about what it makes you feel." Ethan nodded slowly, clearly considering Alexander's words. There was a quiet understanding between them in that moment, something unspoken but deeply felt. They weren't just father and son. They were two people connecting on a deeper level, sharing something that went beyond blood or obligation. After their tour of the museum, they grabbed lunch at a small cafe nearby. Alexander had chosen the place carefully. He didn't want anything too fancy or intimidating for Ethan. He wanted it to feel relaxed, comfortable, As they sat down with their sandwiches and drinks, the conversation turned toward lighter topics: video games, favorite movies, Ethan's friends. It was during this easy banter that Alexander realized how much he enjoyed spending time with Ethan. He wasn't just trying to build a relationship out of duty or guilt anymore. He genuinely wanted to be in Ethan's life, to be someone his son could trust and confide in. The more time they spent together, the more Alexander saw pieces of himself in Ethan. Not just in the way they looked, but in their thoughts, their humor, their way of seeing the world. Ethan, for his part, seemed more relaxed than Alexander had ever seen him. He laughed at Alexander's jokes, teased him about his lack of gaming knowledge, and even asked more questions about his work. It was as if the walls between them were slowly crumbling, replaced by something that felt more like friendship than anything else. At one point, Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "I didn't think this would be, this easy." Alexander looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." Ethan shrugged, looking down at his sandwich. "I thought it would be weird hanging out with you, but it's not. It's kind of cool." Alexander smiled, feeling a surge of pride and relief. "I'm glad you think so. I'm having a pretty good time, too." Ethan grinned, his face lighting up in a way that Alexander hadn't seen before. It was the first time he had seen his son genuinely happy, without any of the sadness or confusion that had clouded their earlier interactions. In that moment, Alexander felt like they were making real progress, like they were finally starting to build the relationship he had always hoped for. As the day came to an end and Alexander dropped Ethan off at Camila's apartment, he found himself lingering for a moment, not wanting the day to be over just yet. He watched as Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt, a smile still playing on his lips from their conversation. "Thanks for today," Ethan said, glancing at Alexander. "It was fun." "Anytime," Alexander replied, his voice warm. "We should do it again soon." Ethan nodded, and for a brief moment, Alexander could see the boy's hesitation, like he wanted to say something more, but wasn't sure how. Finally, Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice quieter than before. I'm glad you're here," Ethan said, the words tumbling out quickly, as if he were afraid to say them too slowly. "Like in my life, I mean." The admission hit Alexander harder than he expected. He felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment, he wasn't sure he could speak. But he smiled, his heart swelling with pride and affection for the boy in front of him. "I'm glad too," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm really glad, Ethan." Ethan gave him one last nod before stepping out of the car and heading into the apartment building. Alexander watched him go, his chest filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. For the first time in his life, Alexander Cruz wasn't thinking about business or money or success. He wasn't thinking about the deals he had made or the empire he had built. The only thing that mattered now was the boy who had just walked into that apartment building, the son he had never known but now couldn't imagine living without. And as he drove away, Alexander made a silent promise to himself. He would never let Ethan feel abandoned again. As the weeks rolled into months, the bond between Alexander and Ethan continued to grow. What had started as tentative meetings evolved into a natural rhythm, with their weekends often filled with art projects, movie nights, and long drives exploring the city. Alexander found joy in the simplest of moments, watching Ethan lose himself in sketching, sharing laughs over their favorite movies, and even the occasional competitive gaming session that left both of them in stitches. Yet, amidst the laughter and growing connection, there lingered an unspoken heaviness that Alexander sensed in Ethan. The boy had lost his mother, and while they had made strides in building their relationship, the grief still hung over them like a shadow. Alexander knew he had to address it eventually, but he didn't want to force Ethan into an uncomfortable conversation. He wanted Ethan to come to him when he was ready. One Saturday, after a particularly enjoyable day spent at a local art fair, they returned to Camila's apartment, both of them buzzing with energy. Ethan had picked out a few art supplies, excited to try some new techniques he had seen at the fair. As they settled on the couch to start their new project, Alexander glanced at Ethan, who was sketching furiously, his brows furrowed in concentration. "Hey, Ethan," Alexander said gently, breaking the comfortable silence. You've been doing really well in school. Your teachers must be proud." Ethan paused for a moment, looking up from his sketchbook. "Yeah, I guess. I mean, I try. You try hard." "I see it," Alexander replied, encouragingly. "You know, you remind me a lot of your mom. She was an artist too. She had this incredible talent for seeing the world in a way that made everything come alive." At the mention of his mother, Ethan's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his face. "Yeah, I know," he said, his voice quieter. "Camila has some of her old paintings. They're really good." Alexander felt a pang in his chest. He had hoped to reminisce about Mia, but he could sense the tension building in Ethan. "You know, it's okay to talk about her if you want to. I'm here to listen." Ethan hesitated, his pencil hovering above the page, his eyes flickering with emotion. I don't know how to talk about it. It's hard." "Hard is okay," Alexander said softly, leaning in closer. "We can take it slow. You don't have to share everything at once." Ethan bit his lip, a telltale sign of the conflict swirling within him. "Sometimes I feel angry, like really angry. I don't get why she had to go, why I didn't get to say goodbye. And I don't want to feel that way, but I can't help it." The honesty in Ethan's voice hit Alexander like a wave. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I understand. Losing someone you love is one of the hardest things we go through. And it's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel hurt. You're allowed to have those feelings." Ethan nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just a bit. "But I don't want to keep thinking about it. It just makes me sad." "I get that," Alexander replied, his heart aching for his son. "But sometimes talking about it can help. It doesn't have to be all at once. We can take it one step at a time. I'm here for you whenever you're ready." Ethan let out a shaky breath, visibly trying to gather his thoughts. "I just miss her, and I feel bad for being mad at her, like I'm supposed to just be sad all the time." "Missing someone doesn't mean you can't feel other things too," Alexander assured him. "Your emotions are valid, Ethan. You don't have to feel guilty about being angry or confused. Grief is complicated." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their conversation settling around them. Alexander felt a mix of pride and sorrow watching Ethan grapple with his emotions. The boy was resilient, but the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. "Do you think she would have liked me to meet you?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice soft, almost tentative. Alexander felt his heart stutter. "I believe she would have loved it. She wanted the best for you always." Ethan's eyes glistened, and Alexander realized he was fighting back tears. "Sometimes I just wish I could ask her to see her again." "I know," Alexander said gently. "If I could give you that, I would in a heartbeat. But the memories you have of her, they're still part of you. You can carry them with you, and you can share stories about her. That way, she'll always be a part of your life." Ethan nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes. "Okay." As the days turned into weeks, the conversations between them grew deeper. Alexander was always cautious to give Ethan the space he needed, allowing him to dictate the pace. There were still moments of vulnerability, moments where Ethan would share his thoughts about his mother, and Alexander would listen, offering support without judgment. One day, while they were painting together, Ethan paused, looking at the colors splattered across the canvas. "Do you think I'm good at this?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Alexander looked up, taken aback by the question. "Ethan, you have a real talent. You see things in a way that others don't, and that's what makes your art special." Ethan shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the painting. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending, like I'm not really an artist." "Why would you feel that way?" Alexander asked gently, curious about Ethan's thought process. "I don't know. I think about how much my mom painted. I'm not as good as she was." Alexander felt a wave of empathy wash over him. "You don't have to be like your mom to be an artist. You're creating your own path. Your art is uniquely yours, and that's what matters. You don't have to compete with her or anyone else." "But what if I can't be as good?" Ethan pressed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Then you keep trying," Alexander replied firmly. "You keep practicing, and you find joy in what you create. It's not about being the best. It's about expressing yourself. You have a voice, and your art is how you share it with the world." Ethan nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I guess that makes sense. It's okay to be scared or uncertain," Alexander added, hoping to comfort him. "But don't let those feelings stop you from pursuing what you love." As they continued painting, Ethan seemed to take Alexander's words to heart. The energy shifted, and he poured himself into his work, each brushstroke a reflection of the emotions he had been grappling with. Alexander watched, feeling a sense of pride swell within him. This was the Ethan he wanted to nurture, an artist finding his voice, unafraid to express himself. As the spring months began to fade into summer, Ethan's confidence blossomed. He took part in an art showcase at school, displaying a piece he had created in their joint sessions. Alexander made a point to attend, standing among the other parents, beaming with pride as he watched Ethan interact with his peers. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and chatter as students showcased their work. Alexander couldn't help but admire the way Ethan had transformed, surrounded by friends, sharing stories about his art with enthusiasm. It was a far cry from the hesitant boy he had met just a few months prior. When it was finally Ethan's turn to present, Alexander's heart raced with excitement. He watched as Ethan took the stage, his usual nerves bubbling beneath the surface. But Alexander could see the determination shining through his eyes. Hi everyone," Ethan said, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This is a piece I created called Moments. It's about finding beauty in chaos and how, sometimes, the messiest moments can be the most beautiful." As he spoke, Ethan's passion for his art was evident, and Alexander felt a swell of emotion watching his son share something so personal with the world. The piece was an abstract portrayal of vibrant colors swirling together, chaotic yet harmonious, a reflection of Ethan's journey. When he finished, the audience erupted into applause, and Alexander stood in the back, clapping enthusiastically. His heart was full, and he couldn't help but think of how far they had come together. This was more than just a presentation. It was a celebration of Ethan's growth, a testament to his resilience. After the showcase, Ethan rushed over to Alexander, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see? They liked it. I can't believe they liked it. I knew they would," Alexander replied, pulling Ethan into a proud embrace. "You poured your heart into that piece, and it showed. I'm so proud of you." Ethan grinned, his joy infectious. "Thanks, Dad. I didn't think I could do it." "You can do anything you set your mind to, Ethan," Alexander said, his voice earnest. "Never doubt yourself. You have an incredible talent, and I'm excited to see where it takes you." Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "I want to keep improving, keep creating. I want to be an artist like Mom." Alexander felt a bittersweet pang at the mention of Mia, but he smiled through it. "And you will. I believe in you, Ethan." As the summer rolled on, the bond between Alexander and Ethan deepened further. They shared not just laughter, but vulnerabilities, moments of joy mingled with the occasional sadness that still lingered. The promise Alexander had made to himself, to be there for Ethan, was now a commitment that shaped both their lives. One evening, after a long day spent at the park, Ethan plopped down on the couch, visibly exhausted but still buzzing with energy. "Can we watch that new superhero movie tonight?" he asked, bouncing slightly in his seat. "Absolutely," Alexander replied, already reaching for the remote. "I've been looking forward to it." As the movie played, they found themselves lost in the action-packed scenes, laughing at the quirky humor. For a moment, the world outside faded away, and it was just them, two guys enjoying a night in. In the middle of the movie, Ethan paused the film, turning to Alexander with a serious expression. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Alexander replied, intrigued by the sudden shift in tone. "Why didn't you come find me earlier? I mean, why did it take so long for you to be in my life?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Alexander took a deep breath, realizing that this was a conversation they had to have. "That's a complicated question, Ethan. There were a lot of reasons. I was young and scared. When your mom and I separated, I thought it was best for you not to have me in your life. But you could have tried," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You could have looked for me." "I know," Alexander admitted, feeling a wave of regret wash over him. And I wish I had. But at that time, I was lost. I thought I was doing what was right. I see now how wrong I was, and I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing Alexander's words. It just feels weird, you know? Sometimes I think about what it would have been like if you had been there. Would things have been different? It's hard to say, Alexander replied, his voice filled with emotion. But what I do know is that I'm here now, and I'm committed to being part of your life. I want to support you, to help you chase your dreams, and to make up for lost time. Ethan looked away for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I guess that's all I can really ask for. Alexander reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You're doing great, Ethan, and we're in this together, okay? We'll figure it out, step by step. Okay, Ethan said, a hint of a smile returning to his lips. Thanks for being here. They resumed the movie, but Alexander could feel the change in the atmosphere. It was no longer just a movie night. It was a moment of healing, a step forward in their relationship. And for Alexander, that was everything. As summer drew to a close, Alexander and Ethan continued to navigate the complexities of their relationship. Each day brought new challenges and triumphs, but they faced them together, building a bond that was both strong and resilient. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its bumps, but they had taken significant strides toward understanding and healing, and Alexander was determined to be the father Ethan deserved. One evening, after dinner, Ethan approached Alexander with a serious expression. Can we talk? Of course, Alexander replied, his heart skipping a beat. What's on your mind? I was thinking about Mom again, Ethan said, his voice heavy with emotion. I want to remember her, like really remember her. Can we go through some of her old stuff? Maybe look at her paintings or something. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat at the request. Yes, I think that would be a great idea. It might be a bit emotional, but I'll be right there with you. Ethan nodded, determination shining in his eyes. I think I need this. As they gathered Mia's old art supplies and paintings, the atmosphere shifted. There was a blend of anticipation and sadness, but Alexander felt a sense of purpose. This was an opportunity for both of them to connect with Mia's memory, to embrace the love she had left behind. They spread the paintings across the living room floor, each piece telling a story of its own. As they looked through them, Ethan shared his thoughts about each artwork, a mix of admiration and sorrow coloring his words. This one is my favorite, Ethan said, pointing to a vibrant painting of a sunset over the ocean. I remember her telling me how she loved the way the colors blended together. Alexander smiled, feeling a warmth in his heart. She had a way of capturing beauty, didn't she? Her art was a reflection of how she saw the world. Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening. I wish I could show her what I'm doing now. I want her to be proud of me. You're making her proud every day, Ethan, Alexander said gently. Every brushstroke, every piece of art, it's a part of her legacy, and you're carrying that forward. As they continued to explore Mia's paintings, Ethan slowly began to open up more about his memories of her. He shared stories that had been tucked away for far too long, moments of laughter, love, and the bond they had shared. Alexander listened intently, offering support and validation. When they finally finished, the room was filled with a bittersweet energy. They had honored Mia's memory together, and though it had been an emotional journey, it had also brought them closer. I feel lighter, Ethan said, wiping away a tear, like I can carry her with me now. Alexander wrapped an arm around Ethan, pulling him close. You always carry her with you, son, and I'll be here, helping you every step of the way. As they continued to navigate their relationship, Alexander knew they were embarking on a new chapter. The connection they had built was fragile yet strong, and he was committed to nurturing it. He had promised himself that he would never let Ethan feel abandoned again, and he was determined to make good on that promise. Ethan had come so far in such a short time, and with each passing day, Alexander saw glimpses of the young man he was destined to become. Their journey together was far from over, but they were learning to embrace both the light and the darkness, and in doing so, they were finding their way toward healing. And as summer faded into autumn, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something incredible, a father-son relationship that was growing into something truly extraordinary. The future was uncertain, but with Ethan by his side, Alexander felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together, they could conquer anything. The first leaves of autumn began to fall, their colors transforming from vibrant greens to deep oranges and browns, mirroring the changes taking place in both Alexander and Ethan's lives. The warmth of summer had given way to a crispness in the air, symbolizing the new chapter they were stepping into. As the school year commenced, Ethan was more determined than ever to excel, buoyed by his newfound confidence in his art and the growing bond with his father. With school back in session, Ethan was juggling his classes and extracurricular activities. He had decided to join the art club, a move that thrilled Alexander. It provided Ethan with an outlet to express himself creatively while connecting with peers who shared his interests. However, with this new commitment came a whirlwind of emotions and the inevitable challenges of adolescence. One evening, as Alexander was preparing dinner, he noticed Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, his sketchbook open but his pencil lying idle beside it. The boy stared blankly at the page, an unusual look of frustration etched on his face. Alexander could sense something was bothering him. "Hey, buddy," he said, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Everything okay?" Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of disappointment and uncertainty. "I don't know, Dad. I've been working on this piece for the art club, and it's just not coming together. I feel like I'm stuck." "Stuck?" Alexander echoed, pulling out a chair to sit across from him. "Can you tell me what's bothering you about it? I have this idea in my head, but I can't seem to get it down on paper. Every time I try, it just doesn't look right. I'm starting to think maybe I'm not as good as I thought." Alexander's heart sank at the self-doubt in Ethan's voice. He remembered his own struggles with insecurity in his youth, how easy it was to compare oneself to others. "Ethan, every artist goes through this. It's completely normal to feel frustrated when you're trying to bring a vision to life. But that doesn't mean you're not talented." Ethan sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "But what if I don't belong in the art club? What if they realize I'm just a kid playing pretend?" "Listen to me," Alexander said firmly, leaning in closer. "You belong there because you're passionate about art. It doesn't matter if your style isn't like everyone else's or if you're still figuring things out. What matters is that you're creating and expressing yourself. That's what art is all about." Ethan's expression softened slightly, but doubt still clouded his eyes. "But what if I mess up? What if I let them down?" "Making mistakes is part of the process," Alexander reassured him. "Every great artist has created something they weren't proud of. It's how you grow. Embrace those moments. They'll help you find your voice." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. "I guess I just need to keep trying." "Exactly," Alexander encouraged, his voice warm. "And remember, you can always come to me if you need help. I believe in you, Ethan." With that, Alexander stood and began preparing dinner, leaving Ethan to contemplate his thoughts. A while later, the enticing aroma of spaghetti filled the kitchen, and Ethan's mood lightened as they shared dinner. They exchanged stories about their day, laughter punctuating the air as they dug into their meal. As the weeks progressed, Ethan gradually found his footing within the art club. With each session, he began to embrace the messiness of the creative process, learning to let go of the fear of failure. He started to experiment with different techniques, finding solace in the spontaneity of his work. It was as if he had finally unlocked a door to a new realm of expression, one where he could explore without the constraints of perfection. One afternoon, Ethan arrived home with a large canvas tucked under his arm, excitement radiating from him. "Dad, you have to see what I did today," he exclaimed, practically bouncing on his toes. Alexander put down his book and looked up, intrigued. "All right, show me." Ethan set the canvas on the living room floor, revealing a stunning abstract painting bursting with colors. Swirls of blue, yellow, and red intertwined in a mesmerizing dance, and the energy emanating from it was palpable. I call it the chaos within. It's about how sometimes all the emotions inside can be overwhelming, but there's also beauty in that chaos. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. "Ethan, this is incredible. You've really captured something powerful here." Ethan beamed at the praise, his confidence swelling. "I try to channel all the feelings I've been having lately. It felt amazing to just let it flow." "That's the beauty of art, son," Alexander said, kneeling beside the canvas. "It's a reflection of your journey. The more you embrace those feelings, the more authentic your work becomes." Ethan nodded, visibly thrilled by his father's enthusiasm. "Can we hang it up somewhere? I want everyone to see it." "Absolutely," Alexander replied, his heart swelling with pride. "This piece deserves a place of honor. Let's find the perfect spot." As they worked together to find a place on the wall, Alexander marveled at how far Ethan had come. The boy was no longer the hesitant child who had been afraid to express himself. He was blossoming into a confident young artist, unafraid to embrace his emotions and share them with the world. As autumn deepened, the air turned crisper, and the leaves blanketed the ground in vibrant hues. Halloween approached, bringing with it the excitement of costumes and candy. Ethan was determined to go all out this year, and after much deliberation, he settled on dressing as a famous artist, complete with a beret and paint-splattered smock. The day of the Halloween party at school arrived, and Alexander found himself filled with a sense of nostalgia as he watched Ethan prep for the event. The boy's enthusiasm was contagious, and Alexander felt a warmth in his heart that he hadn't experienced in years. "Look at you," Alexander exclaimed, chuckling as Ethan posed dramatically in front of the mirror. "You're going to steal the show." Ethan grinned, adjusting the beret at a jaunty angle. "I just want to impress my friends. It's going to be so much fun." As the evening drew closer, they prepared for the party, gathering treats and making plans. Alexander had promised to attend, eager to support Ethan and connect with his peers. He wanted to see firsthand how his son interacted with his classmates, hoping to understand the friendships he was forging. The school gymnasium was transformed into a whimsical wonderland of spooky decorations, filled with laughter and music. When they arrived, Ethan immediately spotted his friends and rushed off to join them, leaving Alexander to navigate the crowd. As he mingled, Alexander spotted a few parents he recognized from the neighborhood. They chatted about school, art, and their children's accomplishments, but Alexander found himself increasingly focused on Ethan, who was fully immersed in the festivities, laughing and dancing with his friends. At one point, he noticed Ethan surrounded by a group of classmates, animatedly discussing art techniques. Alexander's heart swelled with pride as he watched his son confidently share his thoughts, the warmth in his voice carrying through the air. But then, he noticed a subtle shift in the group. A couple of kids began to whisper and point, their eyes darting towards Ethan. Alexander's heart sank as he watched their expressions change. He could sense a wave of unease washing over Ethan, who momentarily faltered in his enthusiastic storytelling. Alexander's protective instincts kicked in. He approached the group, sensing that something was off. "Hey guys, what's going on?" he asked, his tone friendly but firm. The kids quickly straightened, plastering smiles on their faces. "Nothing. We were just talking about art," one of them said, but Alexander could see through the facade. He turned to Ethan, who was now fidgeting nervously, his earlier confidence deflating. "Ethan, are you okay?" Alexander asked softly, kneeling to meet his son's gaze. "Yeah, I'm fine," Ethan replied, though his eyes betrayed his discomfort. Maybe I should go grab some candy." Before Alexander could respond, Ethan slipped away, making his way toward the snack table. The moment felt heavy, and Alexander sensed that the whispers had affected Ethan more than he was letting on. After a moment, Alexander decided to follow him. He found Ethan standing by the candy bowl, staring blankly at the assortment of treats. "Hey," Alexander said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What happened back there?" Ethan hesitated before speaking. "I don't know. They just looked at me funny. I felt like I was being judged." "By who?" Alexander asked gently, wanting to understand the situation better. "Just some kids from school," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were saying stuff about how I dress and how I paint. I just wanted to share what I love, but now I feel dumb." "You're not dumb, Ethan," Alexander said, his heart aching for his son. "You're brave for being yourself." Those kids are still figuring things out, and their opinions don't define who you are or your talent. Ethan looked up, the glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. But what if they don't like my art? What if they think it's stupid? Art is subjective, Ethan, Alexander replied, his voice firm but kind. Not everyone will appreciate it, and that's okay. What matters is that you create from your heart. Keep sharing your passion, and the right people will recognize and value it. Ethan took a deep breath, processing his father's words. I just want to fit in. I understand, but fitting in doesn't mean losing who you are. Be proud of your interests, and the right friends will appreciate you for it, Alexander said, giving Ethan's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. With a small smile, Ethan nodded. Thanks, Dad. I'll try to remember that. As the party continued, they returned to the festivities, and this time, Ethan approached his friends with renewed energy. Alexander watched proudly as his son re-engaged with his classmates, sharing stories and laughter, the earlier discomfort slowly melting away. The evening ended on a high note, with Ethan returning home brimming with excitement, recounting the highlights of the party and the fun they had. I'm glad I went, Dad. It was awesome, he exclaimed, his earlier fears forgotten. I'm glad too, Alexander replied, ruffling Ethan's hair affectionately. You showed a lot of strength tonight. As they settled in for the night, Alexander reflected on how much Ethan had grown, both as an artist and as a person. He was learning to navigate the complexities of relationships, to embrace his passions, and to stand tall in the face of adversity. That night, as Ethan drifted off to sleep, Alexander felt a sense of hope wash over him. They were building something beautiful together, one brushstroke at a time. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them hand in hand, each step bringing them closer to the bond they had both longed for. With the dawn of a new day on the horizon, Alexander was ready to support Ethan through whatever came next, knowing that together, they would continue to create their own masterpiece, one filled with love, understanding, and the unbreakable bond of family. As autumn deepened, the air turned crisper, and the days grew shorter. The school year was well underway, and Ethan continued to flourish in his art endeavors. However, Alexander sensed that beneath the surface, there were still lingering emotions and unresolved feelings that needed to be addressed. As the father-son duo continued to bond, it became increasingly clear that open communication was vital to their relationship. One evening, after a long day at work, Alexander returned home to find Ethan hunched over his sketchbook at the kitchen table. The boy was lost in concentration, but as Alexander observed him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was battling something more profound than just an art project. Hey, buddy, Alexander said softly, trying not to startle him. What are you working on? Ethan looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes before he forced a smile. Just some sketches for art club, he replied, but Alexander could see the tension in his shoulders. Mind if I take a look? He asked, moving closer. Sure, Ethan replied, flipping the pages. Each sketch was impressive, showcasing his evolving talent and creativity, but Alexander couldn't ignore the shadow that seemed to linger behind Ethan's eyes. Wow, these are amazing, Alexander praised, try to draw Ethan out. You've really been working hard. Thanks, Ethan said, but his tone lacked enthusiasm. The smile didn't reach his eyes, and Alexander sensed that something deeper was bothering him. Ethan, can we talk? Alexander asked gently, taking a seat across from him. You seem a bit off lately. Ethan hesitated, looking down at the table. It's just school is a lot sometimes. I feel like I have to keep proving myself. Like if I don't, I'll lose my friends. Proving yourself to whom? Alexander probed, sensing the weight of Ethan's words. To everyone, Ethan admitted, frustration bubbling to the surface. I'm afraid if I don't keep impressing them with my art or my personality, they'll just stop caring. It's like there's this constant pressure to be perfect. Perfection is an impossible standard to live up to, Ethan, Alexander said softly. You're allowed to have off days, to struggle. It doesn't mean you're any less valuable or talented. But what if they don't see it that way? Ethan challenged, his voice rising slightly. What if I'm just a joke to them? What if they think I'm not worth their time? Ethan, listen to me, Alexander said, leaning closer. The right people will appreciate you for who you are, not for some ideal version you think you need to be. You don't have to impress anyone. Just be yourself. Tears glistened in Ethan's eyes as he let out a shaky breath. I'm just scared of being alone again. Alexander's heart ached at the vulnerability in his son's voice. You're not alone, Ethan. You have me, and you have a family who loves you. You don't have to face these fears by yourself. I know, but it's hard. Ethan confessed, the dam of emotions threatening to break. Sometimes I just feel so lost. I understand, Alexander replied, his voice steady and comforting. It's okay to feel lost sometimes. It's part of being human. What matters is that you reach out when you need help. You can always talk to me. Ethan looked up, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. Thanks, Dad. I'll try to remember that. As the evening wore on, they sat together in silence, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Alexander was grateful for this moment of honesty, knowing it would lay the groundwork for a stronger bond between them. The days turned into weeks, and as the first snowflakes began to fall, Ethan found himself on the cusp of a new art showcase at school. This event would feature the works of students in the art club, and Ethan was both excited and terrified. He had decided to display the chaos within, and while he felt proud of his creation, he was also anxious about sharing such a personal piece with the world. Are you ready for the showcase? Alexander asked one evening as they prepared dinner together. I think so, Ethan replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But what if no one likes my painting? What if they laugh at me? Ethan, it's natural to feel nervous, Alexander reassured him, stirring the pasta sauce. But remember, art is about expression. It's your voice, and that's what makes it beautiful. Not everyone has to understand it for it to be valuable. Ethan nodded slowly, but the anxiety still hung in the air. What if I embarrass myself? Then you'll have a story to tell, Alexander replied with a grin. But seriously, just focus on sharing your passion. That's what really matters. The night of the showcase arrived, and the school gym was transformed into a gallery of creativity. Students milled about, admiring the artwork and chatting with their friends. Ethan stood near his piece, his heart racing as people began to gather around. As he watched classmates interact with his painting, Ethan felt the familiar grip of fear tightening around him. But then he remembered his father's words. Focus on sharing your passion. Taking a deep breath, he decided to embrace the moment. Hi, this is my painting, The Chaos Within. Ethan introduced himself to a group of students who had gathered. It's about the way our emotions can be overwhelming, but also beautiful. To his surprise, the group responded positively. They began to ask questions, intrigued by his creative process. With each inquiry, Ethan found his confidence growing. He began to explain the inspiration behind the painting, sharing stories of his journey and the emotions he had poured into the canvas. As the evening progressed, Ethan realized that he was connecting with his peers on a deeper level. They were responding not just to the artwork, but to the vulnerability and honesty he was offering. The fear that had once gripped him began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of belonging and acceptance. Alexander stood off to the side, a proud smile spreading across his face as he watched his son blossom. He had seen Ethan wrestle with his insecurities, and now he was witnessing a transformation. A young man learning to embrace his authenticity and share it with the world. As the winter holidays approached, Ethan and Alexander found themselves even more connected than before. The bond they had nurtured throughout the past months had blossomed into something beautiful, a friendship built on trust, understanding, and love. They spent evenings decorating the house for the holidays, creating traditions that were uniquely theirs. One evening, while sipping hot cocoa by the fireplace, Ethan turned to Alexander with a thoughtful expression. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course, Alexander replied, setting his mug down. What was it like for you growing up without your dad? Ethan asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Alexander took a moment to gather his thoughts, the question stirring up memories he had long buried. It was tough, he admitted. I had moments of anger and sadness, but I also learned to find strength in my challenges. I promised myself that when I became a father, I would do things differently." Ethan nodded, absorbing his father's words. "I'm glad you're here now." "Me too," Alexander said, his voice filled with emotion. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. You're my son, and nothing will ever change that." As the holidays drew near, Ethan found himself excited not just for the festivities, but for the time they would spend together. They volunteered at a local shelter, helping to serve meals to those in need. This experience opened Ethan's eyes to the struggles of others and deepened his understanding of empathy and compassion. One snowy afternoon, as they returned home from volunteering, Ethan turned to Alexander with a serious expression. "Dad, I want to do more to help people. Can we start a project together?" "Absolutely. What do you have in mind?" Alexander asked, intrigued. "I was thinking we could organize an art fundraiser. We could sell some of my paintings and donate the money to the shelter we worked at," Ethan proposed, excitement lighting up his eyes. "That's a fantastic idea, Ethan," Alexander replied, pride swelling in his chest. "I'm in. Let's make it happen." Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly to prepare for the fundraiser. Ethan created new artwork, pouring his heart into each piece. Alexander helped him organize the event, reaching out to friends and family to spread the word. They even managed to secure a small gallery space for the exhibition. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and the gallery was filled with people eager to support Ethan's cause. The walls were adorned with his art, each piece telling a story of resilience, hope, and beauty. As guests mingled and admired the artwork, Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. When the moment came for him to speak, he stood before the crowd, his heart racing. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I wanted to create this fundraiser not just to share my art, but to give back to the community that's been so supportive. Each piece here represents a part of my journey, and I hope they inspire you as much as they inspire me." As he spoke, Ethan looked out at the faces in the crowd, friends, family, and even people he didn't know. They were all there for him, supporting his passion and mission. It was a profound moment of connection, and he felt the warmth of their encouragement enveloping him. After the speeches and the bidding, they managed to raise a significant amount of money for the shelter. Alexander stood beside Ethan, his heart full as he witnessed his son's commitment to making a difference. As winter gave way to spring, life blossomed anew for both Alexander and Ethan. The bond they had forged continued to deepen, and they found themselves navigating the complexities of life together with renewed strength. Ethan's confidence in himself had grown immensely, and Alexander couldn't be prouder of the young man his son was becoming. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in their backyard enjoying the warm breeze, Ethan turned to Alexander with a serious expression. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about my future." "Mo?" Alexander replied, intrigued. "What's on your mind?" "I really want to pursue art full-time. I want to go to art school and make it my career," Ethan said, determination shining in his eyes. "Ethan, that's amazing!" Alexander exclaimed, excitement bubbling up within him. "You have such talent and passion. I fully support you in that decision." "Thanks, Dad," Ethan said, relief flooding his features. "I just worry about what others will think. What if they don't take me seriously?" "Let me tell you something," Alexander said, leaning in closer. "It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. What matters is that you stay true to yourself and follow your heart. If this is your dream, pursue it with everything you have." Ethan smiled, feeling a wave of reassurance wash over him. "I will, I promise." As they continued to discuss Ethan's aspirations, Alexander couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had watched his son grow from a shy boy into a confident young man, ready to take on the world. Their journey had not been without challenges, but they had faced them together, emerging stronger and more connected. As the seasons changed, so did Ethan's life. He applied to several art schools, pouring his heart into his applications and portfolios. Each day brought new opportunities, and he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about what lay ahead. One evening, while they were preparing dinner, Alexander received a phone call. "Hello?" "Yes, this is Alexander Reed," he answered, his tone professional. Ethan glanced over, curiosity piqued. He could see the tension in his father's posture as he listened intently. After a few moments, Alexander's face broke into a wide smile. "Really? That's incredible. Thank you so much for the opportunity." As he hung up, Ethan's heart raced. "What was that about?" he asked, his excitement palpable. "I just received a call from one of the art schools you applied to," Alexander said, unable to contain his joy. "They want to offer you a spot in their program." Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely. You've earned this, Ethan," Alexander said, pride radiating from him. "All those late nights and hard work paid off. I knew you could do it." Tears of joy filled Ethan's eyes as he processed the news. "I can't believe it. This is a dream come true." As they celebrated that night, laughing and reminiscing about the journey they had taken together, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had not only found his passion, but had also discovered the strength of family, love, and the importance of following one's dreams. Years later, as Ethan stood in front of a crowd at his very own art exhibition, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The gallery was filled with his creations, each piece telling a unique story of his journey as an artist and a person. As he looked out at the faces of his friends, family, and supporters, Ethan spotted Alexander standing proudly at the back, beaming with pride. Their journey together had come full circle, and the bond they had forged through love, understanding, and creativity remained unbreakable. Ethan spoke to the audience about his art, his experiences, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He dedicated the exhibition to his father, acknowledging the role Alexander had played in shaping him into the man he had become. "Without my dad, I wouldn't be standing here today," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He taught me to embrace my passions, to face my fears, and to always stay true to myself. This journey is as much his as it is mine." As the crowd erupted into applause, Alexander felt a surge of pride and love for his son. They had both faced challenges, but together they had built a life filled with art, empathy, and an unbreakable bond. In that moment, surrounded by love and creativity, they both knew that no matter what the future held, they would always have each other, partners in life, art, and the beautiful journey of being family. The love they shared would continue to inspire them both, guiding them toward a bright future filled with endless possibilities. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.